I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to introduce our speaker today. I am Michael Perch, an associate professor within the Center for Subsurface Energy and the Environment, and also an associate professor within the Hildebrand Department of Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering, along with the Department of Geologic Sciences over in the Jackson School of Geosciences. We are the Center of Subsurface Energy and the Environment. We are a collection or group of faculty, professors at the University of Texas at Austin, taking on important challenges in the subsurface. We handle a lot of variety of engineering and science challenges, and we participate with industry through a variety of industrial affiliates projects. Now, I want to note the most important one here today, because of our speaker, is the digital rocks for petrophysics. And so I'm sure our speaker will probably mention that too. Now, we do, in order to engage with industry and the public, we do offer free monthly webinars. They're informative, industry-driven webinars by researchers and collaborators within C. We do them the first Friday of the month. You'll notice we're late this month because of Easter. And we do upload these webinars and put them on YouTube, so you can access them. If you've missed them, you can go back in time and see what we've been talking about. I want to also acknowledge that we do have planned upcoming webinars in May. We'll get to hear from Dr. Hugh Daigle, and here's a little bit of information about it, as he works in nanotechnology for upstream oil and gas operations. June, we'll get to hear from Dr. Okuno, talking about novel wettability modifiers to improve oil recovery from tight shale reservoirs. And so please put that down on your calendar and join us for those events. Now, I should introduce our speaker today. We're stoked. Well, we're excited to have Dr. Masha Preradovic, Associate Professor, the Chevron Centennial Teaching Fellow in the Hildebrand Department of Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering. Dr. Preradovic works in the area of multi-phase flow and image-based porous media characterization, level set methods, ferrohydrodynamics, sediment mechanics, fracturing, and unconventional resources. Actually, Dr. Preradovic is my office mate. We're side by side in the building when we are in person, and I've got to see a variety of her exciting research at the very smallest scales. Very, very interesting. I want to also acknowledge some recent awards that Dr. Preradovic has received. The Texas 10 in 2017 nomination based on alumni from our school recognized Dr. Preradovic for excellent ability in teaching. Also, the SBE Regional Award for work in Digital Rocks Portal. I believe in the digital revolution, that Dr. Preradovic is an important part of the digital revolution in the very small scales of porous systems. And I also like to quote this from Dr. Preradovic. One of the suggestions or advice that she likes to give, a little bit of adversity is a good thing. And I think that's great advice. Okay, without any further ado, I now turn it over to Dr. Preradovic. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm going to, as Michael pointed out, I'm very excited always about research and teaching, which is what makes it both the Center for Subsurface Engineering and the Environment and overall Department of Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering a great place to be. And the research that I'm going to present is a result of a collaboration at a great place such as this one. So without further ado, I'm going to present on creating a digital environment. And by environment, I mean data and tools to analyze and process them for specifically porous media applications. Now, I will present on a part of the research that is, of course, dear to me, and the porous media research that is specialized for my type of research, but the general framework is something that can transcend that boundary. So the objective in most of the work in porous media is try to predict what is going on the field scale. So this little cartoon here shows injecting CO2 and chasing oil towards the producer. So that is the field scale picture. On the small scales, we know that we are confined by rocks and the complexity of the rocks there is, so we can never escape that boundary condition. And really, in terms of boundary conditions, those walls present boundaries on fluid flow, and they shape flow. They're essentially the first order of influence on flow properties. And without flow, there is no business. So if I actually look all the way down to the relevant small scale, that is the grain scale, I will see a picture such as this magnified picture. You can see that that's on the scale of the micron grains. And what you see here is the transparent surface of the grains and the trapped oil that is within that surface. Now we have relevant equations. The equations here are not the key, but you probably know from your fluid mechanics or transport phenomena class about Navier-Stokes equation that guides the flow. And here I'm cheating a little bit. I'm showing sort of a two-phase result of a simulation, but I'm showing only a single phase equation. And then we also have Darcy's law, which is on the large scale and which is an effective law that we tend to simulate in reservoir simulation. And we need a bridge from one to the other is actually in terms of a parameter, which is called permeability parameter kappa here, that predicts, so basically the formation capability to transmit fluid is kappa. Fluid property is here viscosity or mu, and then I have the driving force that drives this flow. So this is one example of such equation. Now we need to measure these parameters. This bridge kappa in this case, or sometimes I write k, sometimes I write kappa, is often missing and needs to be somehow predicted. The very practical way to do so would be to do it based on the well logs while we are drilling these wells, and basically just to get the numbers that we can populate this well with. That is not so easy. So we normally have a combination of theory, experiments, and direct simulation. Measuring during the well logging is difficult, and you need to stop the operation to actually measure, and you can do so typically only at some intervals rather than the others. So we often rely on alternatives. One alternative is to go to an existing theoretical relationship, and Kozani-Kármán is one famous one. Typically, you're relating permeability to some grain size, which is here D, and the porosity, which are these upscaled other examples of upscaled properties. This is really often average grain size. And we do have a ways to estimate them, but they're not always direct. Now, in a formation evaluation situation, this works well for some media and not so well for others. It's developed for granular media. This is just one example. There's a range of and a variety of other examples, but all of them have some sort of a form of permeability being a function of grain size and porosity, or possibly multiple porosities. Now, the other way is to actually do extensive lab measurements and then basically correlate them into a functional relationship. And one example is given here for sandstones, permeability versus porosity. And finally, another way with exploring the data that we might have, if we actually have some sort of detailed structure information, I can form a three-dimensional geometry and image and then simulate, get the velocity field from it and integrate that velocity field and then compare to Darcy's law and evaluate permeability from it. All of these have their scales and limitations. So when I measure, I have to be aware of the scale and what am I averaging with the volume that I measure. Okay? So those are some alternatives. Now, where these relationships often pose problems is the multi-scale features or the geometries that are complex for fluid to flow. And carbonates or limestones are typically a challenge, but of course not the only challenge. And I'm not going to go into details of this, but it goes to show that you have to do quite a bit of work to figure out what are your rock types and rock classes. And each of those classes might have a separate correlation to go with it that is informed by the data that we have. And that is a complicated, often a complex process. One promise in digital rocks petrophysics, which is the area that I'm going to present on here, is that essentially, if I have a sample and I image it and I get this detailed geometry, can I just go and simulate based on first principles and get the parameters that I need? Now I'm going to focus on flow here just to streamline the presentation and to show relevant results, but this can go for any other output properties that I could measure given a sample: porosity, permeability, relative permeability, any kind of capillary pressure saturation measurements, residual fluids, formation factor, Young's modulus, and so forth. And again, while I will present specific results of specific methods, the method itself is a matter of choice and it has to be validated separately. The point remains the same. So you might decide to simulate in the geometry directly, or create a semi-upscaled version called Pore Network, and they'll go with that. Each of those have their pros and cons, and each of those have some relevant scales where they can work well. Ultimately, what I want is to do a well log, to do some samples. During well log, grab some samples, image them with the imaging modality that is relevant to that medium, and then build a model that allows me examination of these properties. Now, that in itself, I mentioned you had to take the sample, image the sample, build a model. That process is quite long, and I would still like to actually arrive at a model that I can quickly use, but the model that will be extensive enough and cover a wide range of types of rocks. So that is the objective. Now, just to give you some example of a challenging on an imaging scale. So I gave you the example that limestones can be challenging. If I zoom in, this is an image from Australian National University that I've worked with and that I'm going to get back to in this presentation. So basically, if you have a fracture here, this is a fracture / dissolution feature. There are bugs. There's microporosity in between. And this is the type of complexity that is, even with the most advanced imaging, a challenge to tackle, in part because you need to tackle separately microporosity and this fracture and bugs that we see on this scale. Now, there's a subsample here in 3 dimensions that shows you this bug and how is it connected to a fractured spruce. And there's actually a very thin fracture in between the surfaces that you see here. Okay? So just a quick movie to get things going. I'm just going to go and show now. I'm going to remove this surface, and then I'm just going to see a non-wetting fluid invading. And this non-wetting fluid is colored red, where it invades the rock from the back from this bug, and then gets into the fracture. So this is the result of an LSMPQS simulation. Again, simulation itself is not so relevant right now to the points that I'm making. However, no matter which tool you actually use, you're going to have some residual fluids in complex geometries, and this is something that some of these digital rock models are capturing or focused on capturing. It is the detail that is hard to get to otherwise. And ultimately, you upscale or you average these results into a curve that you can use in a reservoir simulation. So I have just shown you something that is these days relatively straightforward. I'm saying relatively because we do need parallel resources to simulate, but we do have single and two-phase flow measurements, and we have matching imaged experiments. So I showed you a simulation. We have actually matching imaged experiments. And what's coming on is details in the mineral content, origin of the porosity, and adding origins of porosity to this simulation, and more complexity. Where we are limited and where we're just now at the frontier is the three-phase flow. Flow of complex fluids. I'm going to show you one example here on the side, which involves particulate flow in an imaged sphere packing. So these are enlarged for the point, but you will see particles introduced. You don't see the fluid, but the fluid is there, and it's so this is essentially a simulation of a formation damage. Whoops. So complex fluids of all kinds, whether they're just non-Newtonian or they're foams, polymers, particulate suspensions, are still at the frontier of being able to do this 3D simulation. Then further, anything that has coupled processes such as reactive flow or multiplicity of scales. So this is where the research frontier it is right now. Our bottleneck is also that the data acquisition or images that we acquire are much larger than our processing ability. And when I say processing, actually just even 3D image reconstruction, that can be successful, but then you land a pretty large data set. So I call this big data on small scales. And within the processing, we're still struggling with uncertainty in image segmentation. I will not cover much of this. I'm just going to touch upon it, though I rely on it. So in the rest of the simulation, I'm going to assume that there is a binarized or segmented image that defines my geometry. Sharing and using diverse data in any kind of research is a current bottleneck in the process, as well as the fact that I also mentioned and will exemplify already that the simulation can take a matter of days and hours on high performance computing systems. And finally, even if I have all of these pieces, I gotta link them across a length and time scale. And some of these bold topics is something that I'm going to speak about in this presentation. Data sharing, I'm going to sprinkle throughout, but you will hear a lot about Digital Rocks portal that was initiated with some NSF funding. And right now basically serves the community as a portal for exchange of data so that all of the advanced tools can actually access the data and be able to harvest multiple and diverse data sets across the field. Now, let me go and touch upon this automation, or how do we speed up the simulation? And I'm going to call this first part of the presentation Automation Generation 1 for FlowNet. This is a hard work of multiple people, but mainly Javier Santos, who is a student, a PhD student in our department, and he's co-advised by Michael Perch and myself. We are also call ourselves an MP Square as a advising team, and as well as Duoju, Hongonjo, and Chris Lang. So let's get going on that one. So our objective is to, given this 3D image, to leverage computer vision developments, and I'm going to briefly define convolutional neural networks in a moment, and optimized hardware to actually go and provide fast and accurate fluid flow predictions. So we are standing on the shoulders of a lot of computer vision developments so far, as well as the open source Python-based tools that are supporting them, such as TensorFlow or Keras. Okay? So let's see whether we can do that in a fast way and accurate way, because that would basically enable me to do something close to a real-time prediction of permeability on the on information evaluation. Okay? Now we are harvesting really advances brought to you by cat images and videos, quite literally. On the last count in 2019 that I got the access to on the internet, something like 500 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every minute. A whole lot of global internet population is watching YouTube, and most of the mobile traffic belongs to it as well. So managing that content is a problem. And that's what motivated a lot of artificial intelligence tools that analyze both images and videos. So this is one example of somebody who has a lot of views, basically based on the funny videos. And if you actually get a lot of videos like this, I don't know that with my videos that I have posted on my YouTube from either my transport phenomena class or from Digital Rock petrophysics visualization, that I can ever get in this range, but maybe you can give it a try and up my numbers there. Now, in terms of where did we actually see a great breakthrough in the classification of what is in the images, came in 2015, where basically algorithms surpass the human labeling precision. And that is thanks to convolutional neural networks. So let me briefly introduce first what neural networks are, and then convolutional neural networks. In a typical network, you will start with some input, or that is often called features. This is your input layer, and I'm gonna interpret this in terms of fluids. So let's say that you have a fluid kinematic viscosity and density. And ultimately, based on those two inputs, you would like to pass it through a magic network. This network here has only one layer, and you're showing some activation functions that I'm going to unveil in a second. But basically, there are some weights that are associated with these links in this network graph, and then activation function gives a result that ultimately determines a label. And label here would be whether a fluid is oil or water, for instance, in this particular classification. Now, neuron is each of these points. Here is a neuron. Neuron gets input, basically does a linear combination, weighted sum of all of the inputs and plus additional parameters. It's really a linear function. And then it applies activation function, sometimes called sigma, of that input, and then passes the output or gives the output further away to the other neurons that it is connected to. So this is a single layer within. If I have multiple of these layers, they're often called hidden layers, then I'm talking about the deep network or deep learning. Okay? And it's this complicated or intricate connections, choices of activation function that actually create the network structure that is actually something that is not changing during the training. And I'm training this network by giving it data that is already labeled. In this case, it would be labeled oil and water. And I'm hoping that it's going to learn in the process when I give it a new set of data, whether a new set of inputs related to a new unseen data sets. I'm hoping that it's going to do a good job in labeling. So again, the structure of the network is something that is not changing. And what is changing, or what I'm optimizing in this process, is these weights that are belonging, that are playing the role in these sums and activation functions. And basically, I can do a first pass, figure out where's my result, calculate the error, and try to minimize that error. In the process of minimization, I will typically use something like gradient descent or optimized gradient descent to improve these parameters. So as I give it more and more data, okay, I'm going to go through the training process, and if I see that my what's typically labeled a loss function goes down, then I have a well-trained example. There's a lot more to it, but I'm just sprinkling some terminology that might show up later on. Now, what are convolutional neural networks? In the previous example, I had two numbers as an input, rho and so basically viscosity and density. But in my interest, I think I motivated that at the beginning very well, is I want a structure, and not only 2D or 3D spatial structure. So it's an array, 2D or 3D array, and it does matter where is what piece of information. So in that sense, it's spatial. So I want to give it such an input, and then learn from it and make sure that I actually capture that structure in the process. So a lot of times, the way we process such 2D or 3D arrays is with convolutions. Now, convolution sounds fancy. Just remember that every differential operator does have a convolutional representation. So it's not all that different from what we always do in modeling. Okay? So I will typically take a grab of a volume, or if in 2D, it's just going to be a slice. I'm going to pass it through or multiply it with the weights from a convolutional operator. And depending on the size of that operation, here is 3 by 3 by 3, I'm going to get a number that is going to become my downscaled information. And I can do that, of course, multiple times. So here's an example of how this is a slice through a sphere packing. If I give it a convolutional neural network, so there are numbers behind this, but I'm just showing you how what is the image of this filter, and I basically center it at every pixel and move around. I'm going to produce a new image, and that is hopefully this now works. This is quickly done, and then as a result, I'm going to get this filtered image, and that is one of the inputs or features that actually can go into my neural network. And I can, of course, design a number of them. So those are convolutional neural networks. And again, they pay attention to spatial structure. Some of the prior applications for flow problems started about 2016, and that was a two-dimensional problem. Some prior work prior to us gave, in some cases, in this case, that's one of the first, an artificial two-dimensional porous medium, and then tried to label or provide labels of permeabilities, and then try to get the network to predict the permeability. And then some more recent work ahead of us did 3D inputs, but also predicted a single number based on 3D inputs. We are focusing on actually taking 3D input and producing a velocity field, so another 3D input based on the input. So this is the general overview of the workflow. I want to start with a binary image, and idealize starts, and it took quite a moment to take that off. Just wanted to jump from here directly to this velocity field or permeability for that matter. Okay. And that was too hard of a jump. With using standard CNNs, essentially you could not get it to work properly. What we found out, and just before I head on, we will use lattice-Boltzmann method velocity field as a true training velocity, but any other method would stand in here conceptually that this works for multiple types of simulations. So we've learned that basically petrophysics knowledge in this generation one was required, and you couldn't just go directly and just give a binary image. Just that information was not enough to predict velocity field directly. What was missing is some way to link one side of the structure to the other, because these windows are essentially too small to upscale properly further. So we needed to provide something like Euclidean distance, which is distance field within the pores, maximum inscribed sphere at every point, time of flight from one side to the other, both left to right and right to left, and also tortuosity. So conceptually, we found something that we essentially knew from petrophysics, is that the velocity field depends on the structure itself, but also pore sizes, connectivity, and tortuosity, okay? And some sort of neural network function of all of the above. Now, this, when you zoom in, I'm not going to focus on this a lot, but I'm going to point out two things. So all of these blocks are neural networks, and they have details of what you put in. What we took on is something that existed in literature and worked well for image classification, trust of fractures and finding fractured information in photographs. However, we translated it to 3D. One thing to remember is that all of this sounds great, but it is computationally expensive, computing all of the convolutions. So we are right now, with the current generation of what we have available, we're limited by 80 by 80 by 80 input size in 3D. And then our output is of the same size, we get the velocity field out. Okay? So the structure was taken and modified from what exists. Remember, that's something that you start with. And part of the research is actually finding the convolutional or the set of these hyperparameters that work well for the particular problem at hand, as well as the features that you have to provide to it. So let's see how it worked. Let's see some results. So essentially, our original training set was a set of numerically or digitally cemented spheres to provide a range of porosities. Okay? And that is a well-known model for cementation. And we wanted to see whether we can, using 1,000 input samples that come from a simulation, each of these simulations, and we did subsample them to 80 cubes, so which is somewhere here in terms of size. So there's a few pores within. Okay? So those are our inputs that were used in training. And then we tested them on something that is similar but slightly different. And our first set was Fontainebleau sandstones available on Digital Rocks portal. So that was test set 1. So similar, but not the same. The test set 2 was different other geometries that we sampled from Digital Rocks portal. Some of it was limestone. This was artificial multi-scale micro sand. So there's microporosity within the sand, some other sandstones, and so forth. So in all of these, we were basically able to run LBM so we can actually test how things are doing. So that is our ground truth for tests and 2. And if you actually look at the hours that it takes anywhere on the order of 4 hours to 2 days, depending on how tight the geometry is. So the more complex or tighter the medium, it's going to take longer for simulations to converge. And all of this was done at Texas Advanced Computing Center. Now, we had the great success in basically predicting permeability for both the test 1 and test 2. They're all very well matched with the true permeability. However, once you actually get this trained, the CNN prediction is on the order of seconds. So all of this was reported in early 2020. Now we need to move on and see, well, okay, how do I do with heterogeneity's presence? All of these media, they were heterogeneous, some of them, but still rather tight. And our assumption was that this 80 cube subsample that was part of this limitation was a limitation for using CNNs right now, was actually capturing majority of flow locally rather well. So I call this automation generation 2, AMS nets. And again, Javier is the first author, but also many others. So this is a collaboration both from UT Austin, visitors from China, and Los Alamos National Laboratory. And it is currently in review and transport in porous media. So if we found out that if we had what I call a percolating heterogeneity, that is a fracture that goes across, for instance, here, or here, or here, it's actually diagonal. Right? This is an example of the CNN input size using current GPUs relative to these 3 images. Porosity in all of these examples is the same. Permeability is very different, partly because of the presence of heterogeneity. I'm not going to show the results of our first paper in this one because they're not good and training does not go well. So we needed to fix our original learning. Now, question was, how do I have all of this information together at the same time? So I need an eye, or keep my eye on this heterogeneity across the entire image. So I somehow should give my details. I know that details matter as well, depending on the geometry, as well as some sort of a coarsened version all at the same time. And this was basically the fundamental idea. So if I look at the original image, which is 256 cube, but I'm showing here only a slice, I can iteratively coarsen it in neural networks. That's called pooling. But basically you have a little either max or mean average operator that acts to replace, so for instance, 2 by 2 will replace by 1 pixel in this 2D operation. In 3D, you go the same. So that is often called pooling. And our only challenge was, well, we don't want to lose all of the details, so we need to be able to also go back. So at the same time, we will record a mask that will help us to go from this image back to this one, back to this one, back to this one as necessary. And I basically go back all the way to the original scale from the coarsened image. And that can be recorded. Okay? Now notice that if you actually keep going down to 1 by 1 in this two-dimensional example, you're going to get porosity, and that is our ultimate averaged geometry feature. Now, here's this Mast Refinement idea. So if I had the image at the finest scale that looks like this in 2 by 2 world, and the coarsened image would be here by averaging 2.5, then I first upsample, so I just multiply this. But if I left it at that, I would basically not, I would lose the information from the fine scale. But I can record the mask that when I directly multiply each location, I will get to my original image. So this mask can be recorded, and we do, and that is our sort of inverse of the coarsening, what we refer to as refinement. I apologize, coarsening and refinement is something that has a lot of meanings in different fields, but I hope I defined it. I defined it well. So here is this hierarchical MSNet that is informed by SIMGANs that were published in 2019. And essentially, so I will have my inputs, and my inputs will be this coarsened series. We take 4 steps in our work. And then I'm going to pass them to an entire neural network. This is a convolutional neural network in its own regard. And I give it I will get the output, but these outputs at different scales might have different dimensions. So I need some sort of Mast refinement to bring them into the consideration all at the same time. And I will also, so this is my finest scale, and each other subsequent scale, I will take all of the previous information as an input in my convolutional neural network. So all of this is working at the same time. Now, this is quite a bit, so we can always provide more information as we go. But what my prediction on my true solution looks like then, it's split into a combination of information from different scales. So this is the coarsest scale. There's a little more scales here than 4, but this is the coarsest scale, and this is the largest scale. That's how many scales to use is, again, something that one has to work with in the process, but we have found 4 to be practical for the data that we used. Okay? Basically, I don't need the geometric features that we mentioned at the beginning. It's faster and more portable, but because of this multi-scale information that is coming in at the same time, it is captured accordingly. So I don't need a time for a flight from one side to the other, for instance. And model is able to see if it's what we call wider eyes or wider field of view, and spot heterogeneities that might actually go across the entire image. So our initial model became this nested or hierarchy of neural networks of just the structure. And what are the results? So we grabbed a number, first what we refer to as SANs, as just modifications or playing with the grain sizes, as well as existence of fractures and bugs within sphere packs. So somewhat dilated and eroded sphere packs with some heterogeneities built within. So those are all predicted well, they're in blue. Then a variety of micro-CTs, sandstones, and so forth, again from Digital Rocks portal, and an entire set of fractures, both the beast that I showed at the very beginning. Okay. So this is a subsample of it, that is, you're looking at the medial surface through it, as well as a number of artificial fractures that exist on the portal that has been created with different fractal dimensions. Okay? And all of those, the predictions are really good as well. So in many of these fractures that are artificially created, I don't have the neighboring matrix contributing, whereas in these sands that we manipulated at the beginning, we do have both the presence of the matrix and the fracture. So we have a wide variety of images where this works well. So this basically presents 2 technical aspects. It has been quite a ride developing these, and I thank specifically Javier, but also other students like Pongun and Van Pan that have contributed to this. Javier, I don't know that at this rate we're going to allow him to ever graduate because he's doing great work, but we might think about it this coming December. So let me just move on to some discussions of some of the wider points based on this. So all these approaches, they're hungry for data. So in social media, data is volunteer. In our cases, data is large, so even when you want to volunteer it, it might be technically hard to do so. We also know from general AI research that about 1,000 examples per feature are needed for training. So we obviously depend on quality benchmarks that are required if we want to do this for scientific purpose. Labeling cats is one thing, and it's useful, but you don't have to do hardcore science to do so. So is using data within the same research group or a company enough? There will be a built-in bias if we do that. This is where Digital Rocks portal does come in, and at this point there is quite an extensive amount of 3D microscopic data that is more and more available. There's a range of very different lithologies that I'm showing here, and not just static images, but also images of experiments that presently at the volume that they have been recorded, we actually cannot simulate. But these automation approaches are helping us get there. So that is the advantage of sharing the data. Data, however, has to be curated. And it's right now still not in ideal format of a benchmark where you just grab an entire suite and train to benchmark algorithms. This is something that for photographs, it does exist. This is one example of a user on the web labeling or finding, or this is segmentation in photographs, where the boundary is between fish and or all other regions of interest in this photo. Okay? Now, this is something where it's easy to get eyes on this and to label it to get these benchmarks. And what they do have is per photograph, they have about 5 of these labeled datasets. Now in geosciences, here's an example of a sandstone from Folk McBride collection. This is a thin section that is in Digital Rocks portal. That's where we need geosciences and trained masters and PhDs to actually label. And when labels do exist historically, they're possibly point counting that has lost the spatial information. So deep learning could help, but it requires careful training, and the level of data that is there and labeled might not necessarily be on every pixel of this image, especially if it's large. Here's an example of the that same sandstone that is actually available on the portal. So you have a thin section that is this large, and you have, as you zoom in, you have on various scales more and more information. So we need to be able to label and train across the scale, and that is an outstanding challenge to get enough benchmarks like that. So automating unconventional Digital Rocks physics is, first you need all of this labeled data or segmented data sets across the scales. Here's one example from my research where you have Eagle Ford Shale BBSCM image. Each tile is a large image in itself, but this is sampling millimeter scale, which is what is deemed relatively representative of the pore structures. And then you also have to, this is a 2D image, otherwise you can't get this in 3D. You need to also reconstruct. So there's a step of reconstruction of this into the 3D. And then after you reconstruct, you can actually do the Digital Rock physics workflow to predict, in this case, relative permeability. And the measurements are sparse, and you certainly don't have the image counterpart of the fluids within that structure. You typically have one measurement, and you're not quite certain what was the starting saturation in that core. So this is a challenge. The point, what I'm pointing is that on all of these steps, you could, and there is a lot of work, for instance, in reconstruction, so segmentation, reconstruction, flow, all of those, they do have separate machine learning approaches right now, but combining them together still requires an expert and needs to be done carefully in order to be done well. Another student of mine that is defending this afternoon has not done any much machine learning. However, she has generated in this case propant flow, but a lot of particulate flow simulations in quite complex geometries, both on the Velbor scale, in the Velbor turbulent flow, and on the small scale, such as in this fracture that is also from Digital Rocks Portal, and you can see propant accumulation. You don't see the fluid, but fluid is what's carrying this propant through. And she has generated enough data probably for another 2 PhDs to graduate in trying to automate them. Okay? So this is coming, but it's not available today. So with this, I'm just going to point out that a lot of this research was funded by the research program in digital rock petrophysics that we have here at UT, and I invite you to join if you find this interesting and you think that it would help in your workflows. I would also like to do, so the student in question, Javier, is co-advised by also Michael Perch, who directs Direct IIP, and we have multiple others. We are highly collaborative environment, so this is a shout out both to my research group and amazing faculty, staff, and students, both at the center and the department. And I invite you to follow. I didn't have the time to focus on the community building that goes around this, but follow Rocks Portal on Twitter. There are newsletters, there are contests, there's mini courses, as well as data and materials related to them. And I also invite you to check out SB virtual workshop on open subsurface that is happening in May, and I'm part of the organizing committee. So with that, I will stop and ask, see what questions did I get. Is the effect of microporosity on fluid flow significant in the case of carbonate? If yes, how to study using digital rock physics and validate the lab test? So this is the part. Yes, so it can be. It depends again on the spatial distribution of microporosity and anything else that might go there. So happen there. So in tight carbonates, it's definitely important. Now there are experiments of the that you can actually do on lab scale with X-ray microtomography, and you will get micron scale. That micron scale resolution will not resolve all of the microporosity you need. What's often brought into is in a single SEM that is matched to the three-dimensional image from microtomography to actually populate the model. But the answer is yes. It does require, the moment you have multi-scale, then you need to calibrate a little more, and you need to possibly go from direct simulation, which is what I was showing, to something that is semi-upscaled like network models. Yes, does the CNN architecture is it inherited from a known one? Yes. So in this case, all of this is an example of a technology transfer. So we started from known CNN architectures that worked on a problem that looked like it might be relevant to this work. And this is where then our specialist knowledge comes in, because we know better the features that might play a role in prediction that you then need to. So you need to sometimes, in the case of that generation one, we created inputs that we were informed from petrophysics and years of work that have been going on in digital rock petrophysics before that. So in that case, yes, it was a type of a unit that was inherited from existing work in recognizing fractures from images. In the second work, the multi-scale work, it's a relatively recent 2019 paper on syn GANs. And I'm forgetting now the author, the title author. It was Tamar. Tamar was the first name, but I'm pretty bad with names, so I apologize, but I can get it to you. Coarsening an image using an averaging of a neighborhood may violate the subsampling theorem and create spurious edge effects in the Fourier sense. Is this having any influence on the subsequent learning process? For now, we think we have mitigated that with that masking. So one spurious effect is that if you do averaging, you suddenly create microporosity where there was none. So you can either open up your geometry or close it down depending on what's going on locally. So because of that, we have that step of remembering the mask and enforcing it during the refinement. More generally speaking, have you tried any other coarsening kernels and looked at the effect of learning? So far, these were the ones we tried. General averaging does work, and I think this same mask that is used within needs to be carefully tailored. Now, one part that I haven't talked about at all is that how does a single that what I refer to as network on each scale, NN1, NN2, NN3, that in itself is a little bit of a beast that has quite a number of choices within that took a moment to tailor to the problems that are flow oriented. So most of the time when we do this technology transfer, it comes from imaging science. We're just analyzing static images, or maybe it's a video, but it's not necessarily focused on the transport problem, right, in itself that you're trying to emulate. So in that sense, one has to carefully tailor the choices of activation functions and so forth to be better tailored for flow. Except CNN, what deep learning based methods do you advise for working with images? GANs, or generative adversarial GANs. I have trouble with that middle word. They're coming from adversaries, so they're pitting. So instead of just trying to label, you're also trying to generate input. So those have taken internet by the storm in terms of if you have heard about deep fakes. So basically creating video input that is not real. They're essentially attempting, instead of just labeling something as this or that or having this or that permeability, you're actually trying to generate that same input. Now, deep fakes aside, there has been quite a bit of success with GANs for reconstruction, which is one of the key things that we often have two-dimensional or limited information. In subsurface, we're always, I don't think it's a surprise that we're always working with the limiting information. So in that sense, reconstructing into a third dimension is something that is always of interest, and that's where GANs have been quite popular. Is it right to say that the ultimate goal is to have surrogate models that run faster than the conventional numerical simulation? If that's the case, did you reach this goal in the works you presented? Thank you. Yes, we have. I believe we have reached it for the permeability. So for the objective of getting an image, given an image, getting the permeability, I think we have done well, and we of course need more data. So all of these results are as good as the data we use to train them. So there's work to be done there, and I'm sure that there's a little bit of tailoring of the existing methods that needs to be done in that regard. That said, as I pointed out, our problem is the moment I just can get a permeability, I need also those samples. So I need libraries of these digital images that will enable us to create image that looks like what we think might be there in subsurface. So there's a bit of this reconstruction process based on the available data that is now outstanding problem. So, and there is again, GAN work that I mentioned is there as well, but it's bringing those together is something that is the next frontier. So combining multiple deep learning effectively into something that you trust. That is where experts need to agree. There was a question on saying, I don't get the point of the cat videos on YouTube. The point that was made is that there was a whole lot of technology in artificial intelligence done that was simply there to process the volume of the videos. And a lot of the traffic that is on YouTube is actually, it's not scientifically relevant. It's for fun. So we are basically standing on, or we have taken certain certain technology that has been developed to process large volumes of those, and we are adjusting it for scientific purpose. And those same cat videos are driving a business model on YouTube. So I guess it's a philosophical point of how life works in unexpected ways. And you would also say that scientific visualization was basically driven by gaming.